Israel and Hamas will cease fire across the Gaza Strip border as of 2 a.m. on Friday morning. The decision came a day after US President Joe Biden urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to seek a de-escalation. A Hamas official said that the ceasefire will be mutual and simultaneous. Israeli media reported that Netanyahu's security cabinet approved the truce. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed, including 60 children, since the conflict started on May the 10th. To talk to us a little bit more about this, we're now joined by Na'eem Jeenah from the Afro-Middle East Centre. Na'eem, thanks very much indeed for joining us. We spoke not so long ago about this conflict. I guess once Joe Biden's messaging changed, it perhaps was a sign that this day was a little bit more imminent.
Yes, just the messaging, though. I think that Biden was actually following the processes that were already taking place. His messaging wasn't an instruction, but a reflection of what was already happening behind the scenes with Egypt as mediator.
All right, so one question that I have for you, because I seem to remember these scenarios playing out before where Israel, when the flare-up happens, they know that at some point they are going to be forced to get to a ceasefire. And in the period leading up to that moment, they target as much of the infrastructure that's a concern for them and take it out as quickly as they can. Might this have played out? Because when we think about the level of bombardments, it was enormous.
The level of bombardment and destruction was enormous, as you say. And there was a particular tactic to target high-rise buildings, which wasn't as much in the past. But I should say, Peter, that many of us expected the ceasefire to be announced today. And so many of us expected that last night would be, the heaviest bombardment that we've seen in the past week and a half, because that's the usual Israeli kind of tradition, that as they know they're going to be close to announcing a ceasefire, they take those last few hours to bomb as much as they can. That didn't happen now, and I think part of the reason might be that the Israeli military chiefs, already from the past weekend, have been reticent about continuing with the bombardment and felt that a ceasefire was necessary, while Netanyahu was the one who was pushing for it to continue. And I think that from the military's perspective, the military chiefs realized that they were actually not meeting any serious objectives of theirs. All they were doing was flattening buildings, leaving people homeless, which of course is not anything that deters them, but they were not getting anything out of it. And in fact, what we saw this time around was something unprecedented, that the language globally has changed about how people were relating to what was happening. I mean, when you get Western media commentators saying, for example, that Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, then you understand that the discourse is changed. And I think that the Israelis realized that if they continue the bombing, it will actually be worse for them in terms of public relations than better.
Reports are that Egypt had quite a hand in negotiating the ceasefire. What did they do?
Well, Egypt was the main mediator. The United States was kind of looking on over Egypt's shoulder. But Egypt has, it has relations with Hamas. I'm not sure that I would say good relations, but Hamas is open to a role for Egypt, and it has very good relations with Israel. So the Egyptian attempt started last week already to reach a ceasefire in a way that both parties would be happy with it. Hamas, of course, last week indicated that they were ready for such a thing. The Israelis were not. But interestingly, Peter, the ceasefire that's been announced by both Hamas, representing the resistance in Gaza, as well as by Israel, doesn't say that there's anything more to this deal than a ceasefire. This is interesting because, in a sense, the battlefield of Gaza was one of 4 fronts that Israel was facing. The other 3 being the West Bank, where Israel killed more than 12 people, Jerusalem, where the uprising continues, and within Israel itself, where, again, an unprecedented thing that Palestinian citizens of Israel rose up in a way in the past week and a half that they never have in the past. So while the ceasefire has been done in Gaza, none of these other 3 fronts have been covered in the deal, it seems. And so what we'll see is the uprising continuing in these other areas.
You've partly answered my next question would be, what now that we have the ceasefire on the table might be the consequences of what we've seen over the last nearly 2 weeks?
We talk too often, Peter. I know what you're going to ask. Look, the consequences for Gaza, of course, is always in these kind of circumstances quite dire. The destruction that we saw on our TV screens of infrastructure, buildings, etc., and with a siege that's been going on for the past 14 years, where they're not even allowed reconstruction material to come in, etc., it's serious. And of course, more than 230 people killed, of whom about 70 were children. So it's quite serious. But apart from Gaza, well, let me say that the other thing about the Gaza situation, apart from the fact that the public discourse and public opinion globally seems to have changed somewhat, is that from the perspective of the resistance, and when I say that, I mean not only Hamas, but the other resistance factions that were part of the effort from Gaza in the past week and a half, from their perspective, they believe that Israel didn't make any serious gains against them. Consider that some of the more advanced missiles that they have available in Gaza, they haven't even started deploying those yet. So from their perspective, they held Israel back and forced a ceasefire long before the 2014 ceasefire, for example, which was 40 some odd days. But in terms of the rest of the country, these unprecedented actions that we saw in Israel, they continue. I think Israel and Israeli society will never be the same again. The fault lines between its Palestinian citizens and its Jewish citizens has shown up very, very sharply in the past week and a half. And I think that this is really, in the longer term, this is going to be the part of the Palestinian community that we need to watch quite carefully for how they refuse now to be subjected to the apartheid that they have been.
All right, let's stay in Israel now. And I'm just curious, we saw a Supreme Court delay their decisions about evictions in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. Might these conversations now take a different turn, given, as you say, the international rhetoric and some of the backlash that's come out as a result of these past 2 weeks?
Technically, we're not staying in Israel, Peter, because Jerusalem is not regarded under international law as being part of Israel. But I think this is something that we need to watch. I think that it's not a done deal, that things will change as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, unless the Americans make good on the warning that they gave last week, which was a warning to Israel that they need to look much more carefully at these forced removals and deal with it in a different way. If the Americans decide to pursue that line and put some pressure on Israel not to allow the forced removals to take place, then I think we might see a change. Otherwise, if things kind of go back to normal business as far as the global or the international community is concerned, then the Israeli Supreme Court too will go back to normal business and will rule quite likely against those Palestinians who've been living in these homes for generations. So I think that it's still on the precipice, and we're not sure yet which way it will go.
All right, let's go to Gaza now. Where does Hamas come out of this with Palestinian people? Because there are thousands and thousands of people now homeless. Do they blame only Israel, or are they also fatigued by the military goings-on between Hamas and Israel, because citizens get caught up in it and they're not part of it?
Peter, we must remember that people in Gaza have been living under hermetic siege for 14 years. And so they really don't feel that things can get worse than they already are. The resistance factions in Gaza have received enormous support in the past week and a half. I mean, you must have seen as well the pictures of an old woman who loses two of her kids killed in an Israeli bombing, and mourns her kids and says, "But I love the resistance." This is the kind of feeling within Gaza at the moment. And if anything, the resistance factions, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, etc., have become more heroes now than they were 2 weeks ago. But in the broader Palestinian society as well, I mean, the one thing that we saw coming out of the past week and a half, actually from before the past week and a half, from the time of the forced removals in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, is a kind of Palestinian unity that we haven't seen in a long time. People preferred to forget that they belonged to particular political factions and focused directly on Israel. For people in Gaza, they regard Israel as the main culprit that they should blame. But also, I should just add, many people in Gaza are pointing to the various Arab governments, particularly those who have recently undertaken normalization deals with Israel, and saying that they are complicit with Israeli crimes in Gaza.
And Joe Biden, he must be breathing a sigh of relief that this moment has come. But do you think that a little sparkle has disappeared off his armor as a result of the way he handled this particular story, this chapter?
I'm not sure about that. Look, I think he, of course, you're right. He became quite uncomfortable in the past 2 weeks because he had decided that the Palestinian-Israeli issue is going to be way down on his agenda. He wasn't going to deal with it. He wasn't going to make any big pronouncements about it. He had other things to deal with in terms of foreign policy, Iran, for example, and as he said, China, and then a whole range of domestic issues. So he didn't want to deal with this, but it was forced onto his agenda. He dealt with it quite typically for an American president. So despite it being low on his agenda, he followed the script that other American presidents have followed in defending Israel, in repeating, on every few hours that Israel had a right to defend itself, etc. So the script was the same. The difference now, however, is that he's receiving pushback from within his own party, which hadn't happened before with any other American president. And Congress people, Democratic Party Congress people have been speaking out quite strongly. And I'm not talking about the usual suspects like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, the so-called squad, but even others who have been speaking out against Israeli actions, and then American media that have taken a position that they hadn't taken before. So I think going forward, he is going to have to reconsider whether he leaves the Palestinian issue at the bottom of his in tray, whether he moves it up in his in tray, and whether he should continue dealing with the issue as his predecessors have, or whether he should listen more to other people in his party and deal with it differently. I'm not sure how he's going to go, but I think that his attitude has to change from what it was 2 weeks ago.
What does it mean for Netanyahu? Because he spoke like it was part of an election campaign at times, appearing to be the one that's going to save Israel and show Palestine a point, etc., etc. He'd failed to form a government, and that had been given, the opportunity had been given to the guy who came second. Might this help his own political aspirations, or has that horse bolted already?
No, it won't. So this is the reason, of course, that he tried to prolong it, because he hoped that prolonging it will give him some victories in Gaza, and therefore help his political life. But he didn't get any of those victories. His own military chiefs were not too pleased about it. And he's ended up in a situation where he's not able to say to his electorate anything that he has delivered in terms of this. And in fact, even up to yesterday, he was saying that, we have two options. We either conquer Hamas, or we use our deterrence capacity to make sure that they're not able to do this again. Neither of those two has happened. But the other dimension is that he ended up with a situation within Israel that hasn't happened to a prime minister before, that he doesn't know how to deal with. He hasn't dealt with it properly, which is, these crazy vigilante gangs that have been going out and attacking Palestinians, for example, and the protests by Palestinians, barricades in various cities and towns across Israel. So he has been prime minister over this kind of development. I don't think that it's going to do his political life any favors. I think that the other guy who's been very quiet, Yair Lapid, in the past 2 weeks or past week and a half, I think he's smiling right now.
It seems almost like centuries ago when we talked about the Oslo Accords, we talked about Camp David, we talked about Taba Summit. And I just wonder, after this past 2 weeks, what are the chances that there could ever be a sitting around of a table to discuss peace?
Well, I think that ultimately there will have to be a sitting around a table. But you're right. I mean, Oslo, Camp David, all of those things feel like they were centuries ago, and they, part of some history book that is completely irrelevant in this day and age. And so also are the creations of Oslo. The Palestinian Authority has been shown up in the past 2 weeks to be completely irrelevant. And so moving forward, in a general sense, I think that the world needs to be looking at the whole situation quite differently. The past week and a half has stamped on the whole situation post-Oslo. In fact, it's a past Oslo in some ways. So I think that things have to be looked at differently. Because none of those proposals or their products, like the PA, have been shown to be relevant anymore.
I remember when we spoke about Bahrain and company establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. You said that at that time that Palestine was going through perhaps one of its most difficult periods because it was starting to become a little forgotten, and they were becoming a little bit more isolated. Has this helped change that narrative for them?
Well, Netanyahu certainly helped to put Palestinians front and center in the news over the past week and a half. So yes, I think it has changed things somewhat. As I said, in terms of popular opinion across the globe, we saw that happening, mainstream media in the West, Paris Hilton tweeting in support of Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, I don't even really know who Paris Hilton is, but apparently, she has 17 million followers, so that means something. And as much as I say the PA has been shown up to be irrelevant, these states that signed the normalization deals, they also, have been, since those deals were signed, have been really very aggressive in marketing them. And that's not got them anything. The Palestinians have proven to us that they cannot be forgotten, that they are right in front of our imagination and right in front on our TV screens, and they have to be dealt with. They have to be addressed, and their concerns have to be addressed. And I don't think that that the world is going to be able to just push them into the rubbish heap.
All right. Are you not worried that much like social media, things trend for a few days, they're talking points, and then Next week, America's busy dealing with an inquiry into what happened in January. Then Myanmar comes back on the radar, and Russia, something else happens there. That the international community, all of this energy and this talking will disappear, and that sadly, all the things that the Palestinians are fighting for do not become as much of a priority. Unlike what perhaps happened here in South Africa, where once the apartheid story really broke water on the international community, it seemed as if it just became a snowball that couldn't be stopped.
Look, I don't think that the Palestinian issue is at that point yet of becoming a snowball. But I think that many governments are going to have to reconsider. Look at our own government, Peter. From the first statement that was issued just after the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to the president's statement on Monday, and the day before, our ambassador's statement to the United Nations Security Council. A huge difference in 1 week in where they've gone with their positions. The language changed, the strength of the statements changed, etc. I don't think that DIRCO or the presidency is simply going to be able to go back to the statement from last week, Monday. I don't think that in the US, those Congress people who took a strong position in the past few weeks are going to let this just die and let the focus move elsewhere as easily as perhaps in the past. It's not at that snowball point yet, but I think that this might be the beginning of forces in different parts of the world starting to collect snow.
And what about the region? The Middle East and surrounds. Has this moment in time shifted things in any way, or things carry on as they were?
I think for some of the governments, things carry on as they were. Think of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, which has normalized relations with Israel, etc. But for others, not so much. I think that the Iranians are celebrating in terms of what the resistance has done. The Lebanese are. What does that mean in terms of those two countries and their own negotiations, in the case of Iran, with the US, and in terms of Lebanon and its kind of muscle that it wants to show towards Israel? I think we'll wait and see. But to a large extent, I don't think that the region more broadly has been seriously affected or is going to change trajectory. But I think in terms of how they relate to the Palestinian issue, they might be forced to do so.
All right, and perhaps as a final thought, so a significant moment, this ceasefire, and what you're saying is nothing will ever be the same as it was as a result of the past 10, 11 days.
Yes, I think certainly for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's not going to be the same. I think Palestinians have drawn an enormous amount of optimism from what has happened, despite the destruction in Gaza, despite the fact that more than 10 people, more than 12 people were killed in the West Bank, despite the fact that Palestinians were killed in Israel as well through some of these gang attacks, etc. Palestinians around the world have developed a new kind of sense of optimism, and it seems to me that optimism, they're not just going to let it die. So yes, I think that this might be something of a new turning point that we're seeing.
Na'eem Jeenah, thank you very much indeed. Always great to get your insights on this very troubled part of the world. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, that's Na'eem Jeenah from the Afro-Middle East Centre talking to us about breaking news that the Palestinians and Israel have agreed a ceasefire 2 a.m. Friday morning. And that's, of course, is in about 2 hours and 15 minutes from now. And that ceasefire coming at a time where more than 200 lives have been lost, and there have been Israeli casualties as well. So that will be welcomed by the people, particularly in Gaza, who've seen buildings crushed by bombs and missiles. And also the Israelis will see a ceasing of rocket fire, which they'll also take comfort in.